Welcome to Critical Thinking Assignment 2 at Bryan University. As you may recall from Assignment 1, critical thinking is all about having good reasons for the conclusions that we make. Before you get started with this teaching video, consider, what does it mean to exercise your mind? How do you stretch your mind in different ways? What is an inquiring mind? Are you a curious person? Do you look for answers to the questions that you have? In this assignment, we're going to begin with argument reconstruction. Remember, an argument has two parts, premises and conclusions. In phase 1 of argument reconstruction, we look for the premises and conclusions. These are notated by P equaling premise. P1 is premise 1, P2 is premise 2, going on for as many premises as you have. C equals conclusion. MP represents the missing premise. In phase 2, we look for the structure of the argument to understand how all the pieces fit together. More on this in a little while. But let's practice finding the premises and conclusions. Here is a brief paragraph about a lawyer who is attempting to persuade a client not to sue his doctor for malpractice. The lawyer says, "I understand why you feel a sense of grievance, but I don't think it's a good idea. First, you have to prove that the doctor was negligent. That is, that he failed to provide medical care that is up to the accepted standard. And given what you've told me, I don't think we would prove that at all. After all, he did explicitly warn you that there was only a 70% chance of success. Second, a trial will be extremely stressful for your wife, since she will have to answer a lot of intimate personal questions that I'm sure she would prefer to avoid. In this situation, when you are looking to find the argument, always start with the conclusion in mind. What is the main point of the argument? What is the primary claim? After you discern the primary claim, look for the support of that claim. In this slide, I've demonstrated for you the conclusion, premise 1, premise 2, and premise 3. You'll see that the conclusion in this argument is actually at the beginning. Take a moment to read this for yourself. On the side, you see that I have labeled the premises as well as put them in a condensed form, so you can see how it starts with premise 1 to premise 2 to premise 3, and finally a conclusion. What should you do when there's a missing premise? Well, remember, a missing premise relies on making assumptions. An assumption is taking something for granted as true without proof. It's healthy suspicion. Be objective. Listen and evaluate your assumptions. Evaluate the assumptions of others. Do your assumptions hold up? Do they align with the rest of the story or the argument? Do your assumptions or the assumptions of others contain any bias? When you arrive at the missing premise, if it's true, it provides support. Always look for logical strength. It must be plausible and possible. Phase 2 is argument structure. Remember how we notate the premises in a condensed form. P is premise, P1, premise 1, P2, premise 2, and so on. C is the conclusion. MP represents missing premise, therefore is notated by an arrow. Argument structure is a visual representation. It's an indication of how the premises are intended to support the conclusion. Always think if, then. Now let's get into the types of arguments you will see in this assignment. First is a simple argument. A simple argument has a single premise or reason and a single conclusion. For example, when Jim quit playing the trumpet, he gave it to his younger brother. Therefore, or conclusion, Jim won't be able to lend his trumpet to Andrew. One premise leads to one conclusion. We can also infer in this argument that Andrew is not Jim's brother. The T argument. A T argument has at least two premises that need each other to support the conclusion. This is drawn in the shape of a T. P1 and P2 are on the same branch leading to the conclusion. They are dependent on each other. Here's an example. P1, every medical doctor has had to tell someone that a loved one has died. P2, Beth is a medical doctor. Conclusion, therefore, Beth has had to tell someone that a loved one died. We must know that Beth is a medical doctor and that medical doctors have had to tell people about a loved one passing to make the conclusion have support. The argument. A the argument contains at least two premises that act independently of each other to support a conclusion. The premises do not need each other to make the conclusion true. For example, P1, Frances is very successful in her career. P2, Frances has a secure and supportive marriage. Conclusion, therefore, Frances is a happy person. This is taken from page 40 in your textbook. Frances has a successful career. She does not need to have a secure and supportive marriage with a successful career in order to be happy. And the converse is true. Frances can have a secure and supportive marriage without a successful career in order to be a happy person. The fourth kind of argument in our course is a complex argument, and these derive from previous structures. In this visual diagram, you can see that P1 and P2 are independent of each other, yet they support premise 3. Premise 3 and premise 4 are needed dependently of each other to arrive at a conclusion. Coming up, fallacies. The next part of our assignment looks at fallacies. Fallacy is a mistake. Logic is ordered thinking. Therefore, a fallacy is an error in the logic of an argument. It's a mistake in the person's thinking. Logic helps us do many things. Take a look at the list that follows and see if one of these resonates most with you. Where do we see logical fallacies? Consider your everyday life. Everything from the news media to social media to our daily conversations just might contain logical fallacies. In this assignment, you'll be looking at 4 specific fallacies: begging the question, inconsistency, equivocation, false dichotomy. I'm going to briefly review each of these. First, begging the question. Begging the question is circular reasoning. The premise says the conclusion in a different way. It presupposes, directly or indirectly, the truth of the conclusion. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a scenario. Water bottles are horrible for the environment because plastic bottles harm nature. Hint, A, therefore B, and B, therefore A. I can switch water bottle with plastic bottles, as well as environment with nature, and use circular reasoning in my argument. This is a fallacy. It is an error in thinking. Plastic bottles are horrible for the environment because water bottles harm nature. In this scenario, there is no real support given for the conclusion. It is circular. Next, inconsistency. The fallacy of inconsistency arises when an argument contains implicitly or explicitly a contradiction, usually between two premises. Remember from assignment 1, a contradiction is false, in which the terms cannot work together. This is related to begging the question. Inconsistency. The wife says, "The food they serve on this ship is so awful it's inedible." The husband says, "I agree entirely, and the portions are too small." Where's the contradiction? The wife says, "The food is inedible, you can't eat it." The husband says, "The portions are too small." Therefore, inedible and small portions, the husband is still eating, are contradictory. This scenario is inconsistent. Equivocation. The fallacy of equivocation arises when a term is used with more than one meaning within a single argument. Here's a scenario for you. Apes, dolphins, and my dog Buster are all intelligent animals. They can all learn to do tricks and learn to have complicated social lives. I think it's wrong to say that man is the only intelligent being. In an argument using equivocation, you will see one word used in more than one way. Take a look at this scenario. What word is being used twice? You're right, intelligent. Here, intelligence is being defined in two different ways: the intelligence of animals and the intelligence of human beings. We know that these are not the same. Therefore, this scenario is equivocation. Finally, false dichotomy. The false dichotomy arises when the premise of an argument presents us with a choice between two alternatives and assumes that they are exhaustive or inclusive or both, when in fact they're not. In other words, a false dilemma is presented. False dichotomy will present two choices and assume there are no other choices that can be made. This is also known as the either-or fallacy. Here's a scenario. David says, "Let me get this straight, Paul. You mean that you have been going out with your girlfriend for almost a year and she never told you that she has a 3-year-old daughter by a previous marriage?" Paul says, "That's right, and I only found out by accident last week." David says, "Well, whatever you do, Paul, don't marry her. She's a liar." In this situation, David presents a false dichotomy. He presents that his only option is to not marry her and that she is a liar. We know by reading this assignment and from real life that there are probably more options available for Paul to understand why his girlfriend has not yet shared about his 3-year-old daughter. Therefore, this scenario is a fallacy. It is an error in thinking. It is a false dichotomy. And that concludes the concepts for assignment 2 in critical thinking at Bryan University. If you have any questions, please reach out to your instructors. We're happy to help.